Good morning, dearest friends. Today is Sunday, January 16th. It is the 14th of Shvat. Tonight and tomorrow will be Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, known as Tu B'Shvat. We have our Sunday power session. In the next 14 minutes or so, let's try to cram in high quality Talmudic study. We are studying the entire Talmud, but today Masechet Shabbos, chapter 1198a at Sadik Ches Amud Aleph. Our discussion is about domains, because as we know, carrying Haitzah, moving something from domain A to domain B to Rishus HaYachid, to Rishus HaRabim, to public, from public to private, or vice versa, is relevant. And specifically in the discussion of stuff moving from domain to domain, the subject of the agalot, the wagons, are highly relevant. Why are the wagons highly relevant? Well, because that's the primary instance of transportation, or we might call hoitza'ah, moving something from point A to point B. So on Friday, our Gemara mentions, okay, I hope you can still hear me. Something just happened with my headphones. That if you carry something in a roofed public domain, that's not considered a public domain for the purposes of the laws of Shabbos. And in order to probe this statement that there were no roofed public domains in the desert, we're going to use Rav's own words. His own words, I shouldn't say his own words, the words that he conveyed from his uncle and teacher, Rabbi Chia, that the wagons, beneath them, the wheel area, the sides, were all considered a public domain. And so we're trying to understand what Rav meant, because we're imagining and visualizing how the beams were stacked. And did that consist of a public domain or a private domain? And we're going to share the screen. And for today, we have a short window of time. I'd like to consider the Gemara from the perspective and the presentation of Rabbi Steinsaltz. There are a variety of different ways, and he doesn't always follow exclusively Rashi. So I want to just take the next 10 minutes. I want to go through it. Hopefully we'll gain something. We'll gain some clarity. And believe it or not, we'll continue the conversation tomorrow as well. But don't worry, the Gemara is going to pivot out of a tight discussion about if the wagons were covered or how they looked into a broader discussion about the Mishkan, the Krushim, the wagons, the Yeriot, and the like. So we're gonna move out of this specific discussion in a moment. But let's share the screen and let's have a Talmud power session. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Again, we saw this on Friday. A teaching from Rav. If you carry something for Amos in a public domain, Pater, one is exempt, because there was no such thing as a roofed-in place in the desert. The Gemara says, I think we can point to an instance where there was a roofing over the public domain. The wagons, which we can allege, had roofs. What roofs? So Rashi pointed out to us on Friday that the way the Krushim were aligned should create a roofing area. And indeed, Rav himself says that there was indeed areas covered, meaning under the wagon or around the wagon, that's considered a public domain. How does that jive with Rav saying there's no such thing as a roofed-in space? So the Gemara answers, Kikama Rav Bidarasa. What was Rav talking about? And now I want to use Rabbi Steinsaltz. When Rav said that the space beneath the wagons had legal status of a public domain, he was referring to when the beams were arranged in stacks. The beams didn't cover the entire area of the wagon. There was space between the stacks. So if the beams were aligned in stacks, we could now presume, as the Gemara is going to go in a moment, that there were gaps. There were spaces between each stack. If you've ever gone to Home Depot, or you've ever seen someone with a pickup truck full of lumber, usually they come in little stacks. And so it's plausible, and the same thing was indeed as it was in the Mishkan. And so it's plausible that there were gaps in between. As you may recall, on Friday, we mapped it all out. The length of the wagon was 5 amas. There was 5 amas in between. The next wagon also was 5 amas. And so we imagined how the beams would cross the bed of the wagon and onto the sides, and how it would create this covered area. But Rav answers, or Rav explains that there were darasa, there were gaps. Let's see real fast if we can find the image that portrayed. No, here. I suppose this would be what we're describing. There were these gaps, and so these gaps would be uncovered public domain, and what was other than wagons must have been considered a rishus carmelis or whatever. But the Gemara is not done yet. Mechti, does this work out? Let's crunch the numbers, says the Gemara. And again, we're doing our Sunday Power Talmud session. So, Mechti, let's figure the math. Mark, please stay engaged. I need your help. Orcha the agala kam havoi. What was the length of the wagon? Chamesh amin, 5 amos. Pusya the keresh kam hava. What is the width of the beams that created the frame of the Mishkan? Amsa upalga, 1.5 amma. So each keresh was 1.5 amos. We had space of 5 amos because remember they were aligned
1.5
width
on each side.
of the length of the wagon. So kama moisiv, how many piles could there have been? Tulasa. There would be 3 stacks. 3 stacks of 1.5 equals
3 stacks 1.5 is 4.5.
4.5, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, my headphones just did something. Mark, you just said something?
4.5.
4.5. Okay, so we have 4.5.
And there was a gap of an 8.
Poshle palga da amsa. What remains is half
A half.
an amma.
So you had a gap of a quarter between the two.
So you have hold on. So you have the gap of half an amma. Mark, how many tefachim is half an amma?
Half an amma. What did we say? An amma was 20 tefachim?
6. It's either no. It's either 6 or 5 tefachim. So you either have remaining 3 ammas.
18 or 20. This is 18 would be 6.
So we have this gap. So Pashle Palga da Amsa. So it's plausible. Let's just see how Steinsaltz explains it. What remains is half a cubit.
Yeah, I was mixing up inches and tefachim.
Kishadi Leimar. Kishadi Leimar. Kilavadami. Now, if we evenly distribute them, as the image that I tried showing you here, if you evenly dispense them, so we're going to have an equal gap between the 3 stacks. And now, kilavadami, there is no gap. In the eyes of halacha, remember we said that 3 tvachim or less than 3 tvachim.
Is about an amma.
Exactly. So according to the principle of lavud, where we compress the space, we imagine the gap doesn't exist. There's no need to mind the gap. So kilavadami, now we have no space. And so you just try to tell me that Rav would say that there was the space between the stacks and that was the unroofed public domain. How does that work? So the Gemara is going to give an answer. It might frustrate you, it might not. But let's see the answer. Misavris krashim apusayu havamanach lahu. Do you think we stacked the beams on their wide side? Achudon manach lahu. The way the krashim were, they were not a square. In their width, it was not a square, it was a rectangle. It was 1.5 by, Mark, do you remember? By 1.
I think it was 1. It was
1.5 amot by 1 amma. If you stack them on their more narrow edge, we have more space in between the stacks, true? Now, Rashi says, the Iko Rav Chatzvei. Now there's larger gaps. So if you have 3 stacks, of 1 amma, you have 2 ammas total remaining. Distribute 1 amma across
1 amma
2 gaps. You have 3 tvachim possibly.
Yeah, but can you stack it? Will they stack that way without falling over?
So that's why I said it's going to get you nervous. We're having a hard time imagining that it would be wise to stack something on their more narrow, slender side.
Yeah. If it's just 1, it would make sense. But if it's more than 1.
So before the Gemara, before we're bothered by the awkwardness of stacking. By the way, Mark, it's plausible if you're limited for space. If you have limited space, well, you do what works. And so if you have to flip it on its narrow side, presumably they bounded it.
If you're making with no gaps, then so the one next to it is supported.
Hold on, I lost you again.
know, if you were doing it that way, you'd stack them all together, and you could actually put 5 on the wagon then, because you have 5 amas.
So Mark, you're wisely getting ahead of the Gemara, because the Gemara is going to go a little bit through that.
It's
That was
possible.
that was
it's
for the
possible
record. That was a compliment.
maybe it's possible if they're piled on the side, easier to work with them, take them off.
Yeah,
Each
maybe,
side instead of just one side.
maybe, possibly. So let's see. So before we get into the awkwardness and how it's aligned, the Gemara says, "Soy soif sumcha de keresh hava ame." Let's figure this out. What was ultimately the? Here he's calling it the depth. I guess you have the width, the depth, and the length. So ultimately, what is the narrower angle? I'm sorry, I'll use his words. The depth. There's probably a better word. Soif sumcha de keresh kama hava. What was the depth of this amma? Kama hava moisiv. How many stacks? So Mark, now he goes arba. Now we have to imagine there were 4 stacks. So you're stuck in the same trouble. Pasha le'ams. Hold on. So
Now you have a half an amma though.
yeah. Hold on. So if you have 4 stacks of an amma, so all you're left is 1 amma. Pasha le'amsa. When you evenly. So when you evenly distribute, because I guess the Gemara is imagining if you're going to stack them on their height to be more narrow this way, you're not going to be able to stack them as high. You're going to have to distribute it across in more piles. So now you have 4 stacks of 1 amma. You're back in the same. You're back to the same general picture. If you're going to evenly distribute the stacks, we're back to the same issue of lavud. Why? Because if you divide now, because if you have 4 stacks, you have 3 gaps. Is that true? No, you still have 2 gaps. But if you divide,
No, you have 3 gaps.
why? If you have 4 stacks, you have
There's 3
2
gaps. 3 stacks is 2 gaps. You have a gap. You have
No,
you have 3 gaps.
3 gaps.
In 3 gaps, it will be each one will be a third of an amma, still less than 10 tefachim.
Right. So you have 3 gaps. So if you evenly distribute it, you still have kilav adami. Real fast. I know we're not going to look at Rashi.
But if you go to 4, you can actually get 5 stacks in there.
Right. So he's on obviously the person is going to try to limit the height of the stack, and so therefore you're going to do it like that. Well, tomorrow we'll revisit this. Rav, who claims that there's an unroofed area around the wagons, that's the public domain. It would make sense if you believe that the beams taper down to a point. So imagine the walls of the Mishkan, although they were fashioned out of wood, it wasn't a pure rectangle. It tapered to a point on the top. And we can imagine why this might be aesthetically pleasing or diminish the weight of the whatever. And the Gemara is going to discuss this further. So if we could flip this over, because
that would be unstable.
Hold on. And this is upside down. Remember that I took a picture on it sideways. But imagine that the top is the bottom, and so it tapers up to the top at more of a point. So
I thought the thing at the top was where the hooks and things went to hold.
No. It would be the reverse. The picture is upside down. The picture is sideways, but imagine that these are entirely reversed. So the point is the top. This is clicking into the base. Now look what happens. At the area where it tapers off, you have ample space to overcome it's more than 3 tvachim. And this is what Rav meant, that there's areas around the wagon that is uncovered, that's considered Rishus Harabim, and his statements are consistent. Again, back to the Gemara. And I have to pause right when we get to the bottom of the paragraph. I'm sorry. Shapir, Rav would be perfectly comfortable according to the perspective that says that the beams of the Mishkan tapered upwards to a narrow point. The bottom was an amma, but it comes up to a point. The perspective that says that the beams of the Mishkan were identical, were equal, they didn't taper down. How is Rav going to be able to claim there's a scenario where there's unroofed Mishkan while also claiming to say that around the wagon is a public domain and there's no roofing in the Mishkan, in the desert? Rav Kana, the answer Rav Kana gives is be'at be'i. We're talking about when the wagon was empty, the frames created an uncovered public domain. Hold on, let's just read this fast. Where were these beams on the wagon? So it comes out that the wagon, let's read Rav Steinsaltz, and then I'm sorry, I'm going to have to run. Rav Kana said, when we said that the underside of the wagon was considered public domain, the statement was not referring to when the beams, the crushing, were stacked. It's talking about when the wagon was empty. So all you had was the frame that was there to hold the beams in place. So beneath the wagon, it's not covered. It was just a frame. That's considered the uncovered public domain. So the Gemara says, but hold on, where would they place the frames? On top of the wagon? When the beams were already stacked, they're trying to imagine that there's some kind of mechanism that goes on top of the beams, and the wagon is already covered. So the Gemara answers, we're talking about seidais, we're talking about stakes that would be positioned narrowly, and there was more than 3 tvachim. So basically, the Gemara envisions a scenario where you have a wagon, and the wagon has stuff on it, but the items that are on it are so narrow that we don't have less than 3 tvachim between the items, and therefore that is considered uncovered public domain. I know this Gemara today was a little bit of a teaser. Tomorrow, just to show you, we're going to get into the primary. I don't use primary. We're going to go to the essential discussion about how the Mishkan actually looked. So the Kohanim here, and the Levim here, and the Yisraelim here, all of us have a stake, no pun intended, in to visualize what the Mishkan looked like. When Hashem's help, tomorrow we'll continue that conversation. I want to thank you all for putting up with this tease of a Talmud session. I'm going to leave the group myself, but I'm going to appoint Mark as a moderator. You're welcome to stick on to, do whatever, but if anyone would like to continue the conversation, I don't want to take away your ability to discuss just because I need to run. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Tonight is Tu B'Shvat. I think tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, according to the right. And the main thing is
he was actually born on the 5th.
All right, gotta run.
Okay.